April 15th, 1945. The northern edge of Weimar, Germany, 10:18 in the morning. General George S. Patton, Jr. pushes open the door of his command car and steps into a smell so foul, so sweet, so rotten, that it seems to coat the back of his throat before he has taken 3 strides. Something is wrong. The men behind one stretch of barbed wire are not wearing the striped rags of the camp inmates. A few still have scraps of field gray wool. One has a civilian coat, buttoned high at the neck. Another keeps his eyes down and his hands clasped like a bookkeeper, waiting outside an office. They were not prisoners. They were guards. They wore one uniform yesterday, another today, and no conscience at all. Patton had seen battlefields from North Africa to Sicily to Lorraine. He had seen men burned in tanks. He had seen bodies frozen into hedgerows. He had seen entire roads jammed with the wreckage of a retreating army. But this was different. Here, the dead had not fallen charging a machine gun nest. They had been starved, hooked, beaten, burned, and now, among the surrendering millions of the collapsing Reich, some of the men who had done it were trying to become ordinary Germans again, ordinary soldiers, ordinary prisoners, ordinary nobodies. Dwight D. Eisenhower had already walked through Ohrdruf with Patton and Omar Bradley 3 days earlier. Another camp had now been found near Weimar, worse still, worse than the pyres, worse than the lime-covered bodies, worse because the killers had begun to disappear into the crowd. He had the rank, he had the fury, he had the proof, and in the next few minutes, Patton would decide that these men would not be allowed to vanish into surrender. Before we dive in, make sure you like this video, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Join this community of discovery as we uncover the hidden moments of history that still shake the present, the moments where power, guilt, and memory collided in ways no classroom ever fully explained. If stories like this matter to you, if you want the parts they never taught and the evidence they tried to bury, stay with us. We have a long road ahead, and we walk it together. April 4th, 1945, south of Gotha. The sky over Thuringia is low and white, the kind of spring sky that traps the smoke close to the earth. Patton's Third Army is moving fast, almost too fast for the map boards to keep up. The German front is cracking not in a straight line but in fragments, in pockets, in sudden surrenders and desperate last stands. Columns of Wehrmacht prisoners keep appearing at crossroads with hands raised, helmets gone, faces blank. Farm carts clog lanes. Horses scream under artillery fire. Civilians stare from cellar doors. It looks, from a distance, like the old order is simply collapsing under its own weight. Then the 4th Armored Division and the 89th Infantry Division reach Ohrdruf, a subcamp of Buchenwald, and the illusion of ordinary military defeat ends. This is not just retreat. This is erasure. The SS had already forced most of the prisoners out on death marches toward Buchenwald. Those too weak to walk had been shot, burned, or left where they fell. By March 1945, the camp population had reached about 11,700. When American troops entered, they found scattered corpses, a pyre of charred remains, torture devices, and a shed where naked bodies lay in a heap under lime meant to kill the smell and failed at the task. The first American soldiers who stepped into Ohrdruf did not yet understand the full architecture of what they were seeing. No one at the front ever does. Discovery comes in pieces: a boot beside a ditch, a hand sticking out from ash, the soft slap of a canvas shelter moving in the wind, a smell like wet coal and spoiled meat. Men from Patton's army later remembered how the whole place seemed silent and loud at once, as if the camp itself was holding its breath while the evidence shouted from every building. The roads leading in were muddy. The fences were intact. The barracks still stood. Murder had not happened in some medieval ruin. It had happened in a functioning installation built by engineers, guarded by sentries, fed by schedules, defended by signatures. That mattered. It would matter more in the days ahead than Patton understood at first, because the closer the Allies came to victory, the more urgent the German effort became to reduce industrialized murder to rumor, hearsay, battlefield exaggeration, anything except documented fact. April 12, 1945. Ohrdruf again. Eisenhower arrives to see it with his own eyes. He is 54 years old, the son of David the creamery mechanic and Ida the religious pacifist, raised in Abilene, Kansas, a commander who has spent most of the war balancing tempers, egos, coalition politics, tonnage, weather, and blood. Beside him walks Omar Bradley, 52, born in the poor farming village of Clark, Missouri, a quiet Missourian with the face of a schoolmaster and the authority of a man who rarely needs to raise his voice. And with them comes Patton, 59, son of a Marshall, California family, husband of Beatrice Ayer, father of 3, the cavalryman turned apostle of armor, the man who believes that speed is truth on the battlefield until the battlefield itself teaches him otherwise. They are shown the pits, they are shown the pyre, they are shown the stacked dead. Patton, who had built a public legend around hardness, breaks in private. Witnesses later remembered him weeping. He vomits beside a building. When the party approaches a shed containing roughly 30 emaciated bodies, he refuses to go inside. He has already smelled enough, already seen enough. In his diary, and later in the memoir drawn from it, he would record a gallows where prisoners were strangled with piano wire, lime thrown over naked corpses, railway tracks used as a griddle for burning bodies. He would insist that as many American soldiers as possible be brought to see what had been found. Not because spectacle interested him, because denial had already entered the room. Even then, even there, the dead were still warm in history's hand, and the argument over whether to believe them had already begun. Then came one of the small, terrible details that makes history feel less like a grand drama and more like a room suddenly without air. The mayor of Ohrdruf and his wife were forced to confront at the camp. They went home. They hanged themselves. A local civic authority, a respectable household, 2 bodies swinging in private after the public mask failed. Patton took note of that too. It was not a battlefield episode. It was not even a military action. It was a moral reflex. The noose at home answered the corpse pile at the camp. Whatever the mayor had known or had chosen not to know, he understood at the end that the distance between the town and the camp had been measured in miles only on maps. That was the first American camp liberation of its kind. It was not the last. And 4 miles north of Weimar, something even worse was waiting behind another set of wires. By the time Patton left Ohrdruf, the war had changed shape. It was no longer only tanks against guns, columns against columns, one army breaking another in the open field. It had become a race between evidence and disappearance. April 10, 1945. Buchenwald. Nearly 48,000 people had been imprisoned in the camp system in early April. As the American advance reached Gotha, the SS began emptying the place. On April 7, they started sending prisoners away on death marches. Around 28,000 were driven out, and roughly 1 in 3 died on the road, or was shot by the SS, the Volkssturm, or Hitler Youth units. On April 10 alone, 9,280 inmates were marched off in 2 groups. The camp loudspeakers announced that the rest would be evacuated the next day. In any other story, that would have been the end. No witnesses left, no survivors left, no camp left to inspect. But Buchenwald contained something the SS had not fully broken: organization. Hidden committees, illicit weapons, men who had counted the guard rotations and waited for the right hour. April 11th, 1945. Morning, the enemy alarm sounds. Around 10 a.m., the SS orders all personnel out of the camp. Around noon, the command staff flees. At 1 p.m., the first tanks of the 4th Armored Division appear from the direction of Hottelstedt. At 2:30 p.m., tanks of the 37th Tank Battalion overrun the SS and command area without stopping. At 3 p.m., prisoners of the underground resistance seize the gate building, raise a white flag, and announce that the camp is in their hands. By 4 p.m., they have taken control of the grounds and captured 76 people in the process. By 5 p.m., 2 American scouts in a jeep arrive, Lieutenant Emmanuel Desard and Sergeant Paul Baudot, and discover something almost unimaginable: a liberated concentration camp whose survivors are not a chaos of starving men, but an armed, disciplined internal organization holding the ruins together. 10 minutes later, Captain Frederick Keffer and men from Combat Team 9 of the 6th Armored Division enter at the north end. They are greeted as liberators, and then, almost immediately, they have to become witnesses. Keffer's patrol had not ridden into a vacuum. They had come through resistance, through skirmishing, through the last fragments of a dying system that still fired when cornered. American accounts record a clash with about 15 SS soldiers before the full scale of the camp became clear. Then the visual field changed. Bodies, barracks, skeletal survivors, armed inmates patrolling with abandoned German weapons. Order inside atrocity. It was one of the details that struck the Americans hardest. Buchenwald had not dissolved into an animal scramble the instant the SS fled. It had produced, under impossible conditions, committees, security patrols, ration control, and a handover of authority. One soldier remembered being seized by grateful prisoners and thrown into the air. Another remembered the inmates emerging like magic, like creatures forced from holes into daylight. Sergeant Alex Cormus later reduced it to the words that countless liberators could not improve upon: the smell, stink, depression. Warren Priest of the 120th Evacuation Hospital described blankets, shoes, jackets, underclothes, everything coated in excrement, urine, vomit. At Buchenwald, the senses testified before language could catch up. And now came the problem inside the problem. The SS had fled, but not cleanly. Armed former inmates began combing the surrounding forest and villages. They captured guards in uniform. They captured guards in civilian clothes. They captured guards wearing inmate suits stolen from the depot. One of them was probably Hermann Hofschulte, hauled in after trying to escape, dressed as a civilian. Some were beaten so badly by enraged prisoners that they died. Others were locked up in the camp's detention cells, or Block 17. Michel Julien, a French former prisoner, later described walking past that barbed wire and seeing the imprisoned SS men avoid the eyes of the crowd, while insults and calls for death rose from men who had recently stood on the other side of those same fences. New guards, new rifles, same wire. That image mattered. The geometry of captivity had flipped, but the moral question had not. What do you do with men who served murder and now beg the protection of the law? April 13, 1945. First Lieutenant Walter Emmons of DP Detachment 10 takes charge of the camp. Food, clothing, medical care, sanitation, triage. The 80th Infantry Division provides protection. On the same day, Franklin Roosevelt dies, and at Buchenwald, the prisoners hold a memorial service before surrendering the weapons they had hidden and used to liberate themselves. In another war, in another century, such a sequence would read like literature, too carefully constructed to be true. The president dies. The prisoners mourn him. The captors sit behind barbed wire. But history does not avoid symmetry, it merely refuses mercy. April 15, 1945. Patton arrives at Buchenwald after having seen Ohrdruf. He has been warned. He is not prepared. In a letter written that same day to Eisenhower, he calls it a similar camp, only much worse. He says the normal population had been 25,000 and that prisoners had died at a rate of about 100 a day. He notes that the burning arrangements, according to General Gay and Colonel Codman, were far superior to those at Ohrdruf. That phrase lands like iron. superior, more efficient, more perfected. Technical language for industrial killing. Patton was not a sentimental man, but he understood machinery. He understood systems. He understood what it meant when murder had an improved version. He also understood another danger. Not simply that the guards had run, not simply that some had traded uniforms for civilian jackets or striped rags, but that in the final German collapse they might dissolve into the endless gray of surrendering soldiers and captured men. By May 8, the Third Army would have taken part in the capture of more than 1,250,000 enemy prisoners across Europe. 1,000,000 stories, 1,000,000 uniforms, 1,000,000 chances to say I was only a clerk, only a sentry, only a conscript, only a driver, only there by accident. This is why the moment at Buchenwald mattered, because once the SS Guard and the Wehrmacht private stood in the same IBW system, once the paperwork swallowed them both, guilt could blur into administration. Patton's instinct, once he saw the camp and the captured men behind wire, was not to make a speech about vengeance. It was to force visibility. He would not let the camp remain a rumor whispered in field reports. So he did something strategically brilliant and morally brutal. He summoned witnesses. "I told the press to go up there and see it," he wrote to Eisenhower that day, "and then write as much about it as they could." He had already called Bradley and urged that selected people from the upper levels of the press be sent so that another page of evidence could be built up against future denial. This was Patton at his most consequential, not the duelist, not the profane motivator, not the bronze-helmeted icon from movie posters. This was Patton as custodian of proof. He understood, before many politicians did, before many civilians wanted to, that atrocity denied can become atrocity repeated. April 16, 1945. Patton escalates. On his orders, around 1,000 citizens of Weimar, and by some accounts 500 leading citizens, are marched through Buchenwald and shown the crematorium, the barracks, the bodies, the evidence. Signal Corps photographer Walt Chichersky documents the procession. These are not random passers-by. These are the town's respectable faces, shopkeepers, officials, wives in coats, men in hats, people from a city associated with Goethe and Schiller, with music and literature, and cultivated German memory. Patton makes them climb the hill to the camp and look at what had been done, in their name, in their district, within reach of their roads, under the smoke drifting into their air. He had not ordered a firing line. He had ordered memory. That was harder. And if that sounds less dramatic than battlefield justice, consider what it really meant. A firing squad kills a body. Public evidence kills a lie. Patton had seen how quickly the guilty tried to become invisible. He had seen guards captured in inmate clothing. He had heard of men slipping into civilian dress. He had watched the machinery of defeat flood the roads with surrendered Germans. So he answered camouflage with exposure. Civilians had to see. Soldiers had to see. Reporters had to see. Congressmen had to see. The camp could no longer belong only to the men who survived it and the men who built it. It had to become a fact too large for Europe to smother. And yet the deeper horror was this. Visibility did not automatically produce justice. It only made justice possible. The captured SS men still had to be identified, segregated, documented, interrogated, and handed over. Witnesses had to speak. Papers had to be found. The dead had to be counted. The survivors had to stay alive long enough to testify. The world thinks liberation is the ending because the gates open and the uniforms change. It is not. Liberation is the beginning of an argument with forgetting. In the next stretch of this story, that argument would move from the camp yard into PPW cages, occupation offices, military tribunals, and one of the most uncomfortable corners of Patton's own legacy. And there, with the war almost won, the question would become even more dangerous. Once the uniforms came off, who was guilty, who was merely defeated, and who got to decide? Buchenwald had been opened. The SS had been caught behind wire. The citizens of Weimar had been marched through the evidence. But victory brought its own fog, and in that fog millions of surrendered Germans were moving into custody at once. May 1945. Germany is finished as a war-making state, but not yet as a bureaucratic problem. Every road seems to carry prisoners west, Wehrmacht men, Volkssturm boys, clerks from ministries, anti-aircraft auxiliaries, signal troops, drivers, men who still reek of cordite, men who smell only of fatigue, men who swear they were never Nazis, men who swear they never saw a camp, men who say they were in hospital, men who say they were on leave, men who say they were transferred yesterday. The Allied armies are suddenly not only fighting forces but enormous sorting machines. Among this human flood are men who wore the runes of the SS, men who had guarded camps, men who now stand in the same lines as ordinary Wehrmacht prisoners and hope that anonymity will do what ideology can no longer accomplish. If they can become just another face under just another field cap, maybe history will overlook them. Maybe paperwork will save what morality would condemn. This was the setting that gave Patton's decision at Buchenwald its true weight. He had not solved the problem by marching Weimar through the camp. He had defined the problem correctly. The crisis was not only what had happened in the camps, it was the speed with which the perpetrators could shift shape once the Reich broke open. At Buchenwald alone, American teams soon documented witness statements, drew up wanted lists, and secured 3 tons of documents from the SS camp administration. That sentence should stop you. 3 tons of paper, 3 tons of schedules, rosters, transfers, signatures, orders, inventories, names. Murder had kept records. That fact would become one of the strongest weapons against camouflage. A uniform could be discarded. A testimony could be contested. A frightened witness could die. But paper, if seized in time, could pin a man to his role with the coldness of a ledger. The Americans were learning the same lesson across the liberated camp system. The camps were scenes of suffering, yes, but also scenes of evidence. Barracks were exhibits. Crematoria were exhibits. Tattooed skin used as decoration at Buchenwald was evidence. Medical stores, punishment cells, hooks in basements, ash pits, death books, rail schedules, labor details, all of it had to be preserved before chaos, revenge, sanitation, weather, and time destroyed the chain of proof. Eisenhower saw this clearly. So did Patton, at least in those April days when the camps were fresh discoveries and the enormity of the crimes made euphemism impossible. That is why Eisenhower wrote to George C. Marshall, asking that members of Congress and journalists come see the camps. That is why Churchill and other leaders later sought inspection teams. The Allies were fighting a military war and an evidentiary war at the same time. April 19, 1945. At a memorial service in Buchenwald, the survivors' pledge is read aloud, later known as the Oath of Buchenwald. We will take up the fight until the last culprit stands before the judges of the people. Our watchword is the destruction of Nazism from its roots. Our goal is to build a new world of peace and freedom. More than 400 inmates had died since liberation. Even freedom, even with food finally coming in, came too late for hundreds. That too mattered. Liberation did not erase the damage already done to bodies stripped by hunger, disease, and forced labor. The oath was not the rhetoric of triumphant men. It was the language of survivors who knew that the end of the camp was not the end of responsibility. 2 years later, on April 11, 1947, the Buchenwald trial begins in Dachau. By early 1947, the Allies are holding 793 people connected to Buchenwald crimes, including mainly SS personnel as well as civilians and capos. Ultimately, 31 of the most heavily incriminated are selected for trial. On August 14, 1947, the judgments come down. 22 death sentences, 5 life sentences, 4 prison terms of 10 to 20 years. To a world still raw from the camps, this feels like one form of reckoning. But history almost never leaves reckoning alone. By 1951, 9 of the death sentences have been carried out. Most of the others are reduced. By the mid-1950s, the rest are amnestied. Justice, which looked so iron in the courtroom, softens under politics, fatigue, the Cold War, the West German future, the new strategic needs of old enemies. That is one of the bitterest truths in this story. Patton and others had dragged evidence into daylight because they feared denial. They were right to fear it. But there is another enemy besides denial. There is dilution. Memory can be acknowledged and still be weakened. Crimes can be prosecuted and still be normalized away by time. A guard identified today becomes a defendant tomorrow, a sentence the next year, a commutation after that. Then perhaps a quiet old man whose grandchildren know only that he was in the war. The barbed wire comes down. The files go into boxes. Nations grow tired of looking at themselves in the mirror. And here the story darkens, because Patton himself did not remain fixed in the moral clarity of April 1945. In the immediate shock of Ohrdruf and Buchenwald, he insisted on proof, witnesses, exposure. Yet, after Germany's surrender, as military governor of Bavaria, he slid into political controversy over his handling of former Nazis in public administration. He also made an off-the-record remark at a May 8 press conference that has echoed through the decades with disturbing force. Asked whether SS troops taken prisoner would be handled differently, Patton replied, "No. SS means no more in Germany than being a Democrat in America." That is not to be quoted. He went on to suggest that many had simply been drafted late in the war. This was not the language of the Buchenwald hillside. It was the language of administrative fatigue, political impatience, and moral compression. It did not erase what he had done in April, but it complicated it deeply. Coincidence? The historians who study occupation Germany do not think so. Shock is sharp. Administration is dull. In April, Patton stood before the evidence and wanted the whole world to see it. By summer and fall, he was wrestling with governance, anti-communism, denazification, civilian administration, displaced persons, and the wrecked machinery of a conquered state. This did not make his later remarks harmless. It made them revealing. A man can face horror directly and still, weeks later, begin folding individuals back into categories broad enough to excuse what the eye had already witnessed. That is not merely Patton's flaw. It is one of modern history's recurring temptations. Eisenhower finally relieved Patton as military governor of Bavaria for violating orders against using former Nazis in public positions. The two men had been friends for decades, since the tank debates of the interwar army, but friendship could not bridge that gap forever. The supreme commander, who had walked Ohrdruf and demanded witnesses, now had to reign in the most famous field commander in Europe. The war had been won. The argument over what the victory meant had begun. And still one small, savage document from April 15th remained hidden in plain sight, a letter that exposed just how slippery identity had become in the camp's final hours. In the last part of this story, it would surface like a blade, because here is what almost nobody knows. Even the man who guided the top Allied commanders through one of the camps was not what he seemed. The war was over, the trials were coming, and Patton's own reputation was already drifting into controversy. But buried in an April letter was a detail so brutal, so revealing, that it changes how you understand the entire problem of guards hiding among the defeated. April 15th, 1945. Same day Patton wrote Eisenhower about Buchenwald. Same day he urged that the press be sent to witness the camp and build up another page of the necessary evidence. In that letter he added a sentence almost no casual telling of this story includes. "It may interest you to know," he wrote, "that the very talkative, alleged former member of the murder camp was recognized by a Russian prisoner as a former guard. The prisoner beat his brains out with a rock. Read that slowly. The talkative man had apparently presented himself as a source, perhaps even a helper, a guide, someone close enough to the scene to narrate it for the generals. Then a prisoner identified him for what he really was. Guard, not victim. Perpetrator, not witness. And the recognition ended not in paperwork but in a stone swung by a survivor. That single sentence is the twist at the center of the whole episode. Not because it is dramatic, though it is. Not because it is savage, though it is. But because it proves how unstable appearances had become in the final days of liberation. A guard could speak like a witness. A prisoner could become an avenger. A man could stand in front of Eisenhower, Bradley, and Patton and still be misread until another prisoner cut through the disguise. The camps had not only murdered people, they had wrecked the visible markers by which ordinary justice begins. Clothing lied, role lied, posture lied, talk lied. Recognition came from the people who had lived inside the system, and sometimes it came too late for courts to catch up. Now, the title of this story becomes clearer. What Patton did when he discovered SS guards hiding among ordinary prisoners and surrendering Germans was not simple. He did not trust appearances. He did not accept invisibility. He did not allow the camps to remain private crimes with private witnesses. He widened the circle. He forced citizens to look. He summoned the press. He encouraged senior commands to send more witnesses. He handed the question of guilt over to documentation, identification, and tribunals, rather than leaving it to rumor or battlefield mood. That was the durable decision. That was the thing that outlived him. It is tempting to want a cleaner ending, a villain exposed, a hero uncompromised, a line from discovery to justice without detours. History refuses that comfort. Patton is indispensable to this story, and not innocent within it. He was clear-eyed in April, dangerously careless in some of his later political judgments, and yet still one of the men whose insistence on evidence helped make denial harder for the generation that followed. That contradiction is not a flaw in the record. It is the record. December 9th, 1945. Near Mannheim, months after the victory parades, months after the occupation arguments, Patton is riding in the back seat of his command car when it collides with an army truck after crossing a railroad grade. He is thrown forward and suffers catastrophic injuries. He is the only person badly hurt. The man who had survived machine guns, artillery, air attack, and some of the fiercest campaigns in the European War is suddenly paralyzed not by enemy fire, but by a peacetime crash on a German road. 12 days later, on December 21st, 1945, George S. Patton dies in his sleep at the U.S. Army Hospital in Heidelberg. He is 60 years old. He is buried at the Luxembourg American Cemetery among the soldiers of the Third Army he had driven across France and Germany with such ferocious speed. That was his fate. His consequence was larger. The camps he forced into public view became part of the documentary foundation against later denial. The inspections he supported fed newspaper reports, radio broadcasts, military files, and official archives. The Buchenwald Report of April 16, 1945, the letters between Patton and Eisenhower, the photographs of Weimar citizens confronting the crematoria, the witness statements, the 3 tons of captured SS records, the Oath of Buchenwald, the Dachau tribunal proceedings, all of it became one long chain against erasure. Not a perfect chain, not an unbroken one, but a chain strong enough that when later generations tried to say they had not known or could not know, the documents were already waiting. Here is what almost nobody knows, and what matters most. The hidden letter about the talkative supposed camp member unmasked as a guard is not just a gruesome anecdote. It is a warning from the archive itself. Evil rarely presents itself cleanly after defeat. It strips insignia. It changes clothes. It borrows the language of the wounded. It joins the line of ordinary prisoners. It asks to be processed, categorized, forgotten. Patton's finest response in this story was not rage. It was recognition that proof had to outrun disguise, that witnesses had to outrun lies, that the dead required records as much as mourning. The universal principle rises above Patton, above Buchenwald, above 1945 itself. Justice begins when someone refuses to let the guilty disappear into the crowd. Courage is not only charging a gun line. Sometimes, courage is forcing a civilization to look steadily at what it produced. Accountability is not vengeance. It is memory with names attached. And when memory fails, the uniforms change, the paperwork closes, the witnesses die, and the old crimes begin auditioning for a new century. The war ended. The disguises came off. The evidence remained. And that is why the truth had to be marched through the gates before the killers could walk out of them.